Welcome back to part 2 on our past tenses lessons. And of course, today we'll be looking at the past perfect tenses. So we have past perfect and past perfect continuous. And actually, they're quite easy to use and to form in the English language too. So I'll be showing you how we do this throughout the video. And let's begin. So we'll start with the past perfect tense. Here's an example. He had eaten breakfast. So we use the past perfect to talk about a past action that happened before another action. So in a sense, the past perfect tense is discussing two separate actions. But the main one happened before something else. A little bit confusing? Well, I will help you with this example. I had eaten kimchi, the main part of my sentence, before I travelled to Korea. So two separate events here. Eating kimchi, travelling to Korea. Let's put this onto a timeline. So here's a timeline, 2006 and 2010. And here's some kimchi that looks quite delicious. And here's the event of me traveling to Korea. I had eaten kimchi before I traveled to Korea. So we can see 4 years before me traveling, I ate kimchi. I had eaten kimchi before I traveled to Korea. I had awoken by the time breakfast was ready. Very lucky that I woke at that time. I had awoken, breakfast was ready right at that time. But first I had awoken and then it was time for me to have breakfast. Worth saying, awoken really is more of a British past participle. You may also see awaken, but generally maybe sounds a little bit more British, or I tend to say awoken. So we can see in both these examples as two events, and we're really focusing on the first one in time order. Okay, so let's look at structuring the past perfect tense. So we have subject plus had plus verb, past participle, of course, V3, verb, form 3. We can generally follow this on with some extra information, but really the difficult part is this, or the technical part is this. Subject plus had plus past participle. Now, one really cool thing about the past perfect is the subject does not change our auxiliary verb, our helping verb, had. So whatever subject we use, whether third person singular or whatever type of subject pronoun, had is always used. So we don't need to think about changing into has or had, were or are, whichever it is. We just always keep had, which actually makes things a bit easier. He had lied to his mum before he left. So we've got two events. He, the boy, the man lying, I guess a boy, and then leaving. So before he left, he had lied. He lied. We had fallen out by the time we reached the hotel. We could also, for this last example, and to be honest, any of these examples, use contractions. I'm not going to show you the contracted forms because really perfect tenses are quite advanced in terms of grammar anyway. We have to know about things like past participles, so it's kind of advanced. So I don't want to further complicate it with contractions. But if you're interested, I'm sure you will be, I'll say now, we had would be contracted to weed. He had would be contracted to heed. Slightly more natural sounding. We'd fallen out by the time we reached the hotel. One other thing to note, fallen out. This is a phrasal verb, fall out. It means to argue, to not be friends anymore. And we change fall, not the out, we change the verb part, fall, into the PP, the past participle, fallen out. Just something to take note of in this example. And then we have by the time. We had fallen out by the time we reached the hotel, we arrived at the guest house, whatever it may be. Okay, so in a negative form, it's again pretty straightforward. Had not, contraction, hadn't, plus verb form 3, past participle. Subject, again, doesn't matter. We still always use hadn't, and I'm sure you're happy to hear that. Sarah hadn't gone when I arrived home. In other words, she was still there. They hadn't added their purchases together, so didn't know how much they spent. Okay, so just a few examples here. You can see the second part is also past tense in this last example. They hadn't added their purchases together. Therefore, so they didn't know how much they spent. Past form here. So we have V2. Okay, so pretty straightforward in its use. Interesting because we're really talking about two events, and we're also saying a lot about when these two events happened. They all happened in the past, but just by changing our grammar, we're saying when they happened, in what order. Okay, so let's take a look at the question form for the past perfect tense. So we can use our W words if we want. And here we have had plus our subject plus the past participle. And you can also add the extra part of the sentence. Before something something. By the time something something. Here's an example. Why had she gone to work so early? So I'm not really talking about two events here, but it's still in the past perfect form. Why had she gone to work so early? Maybe before she needed to. If she needed to leave at 8:30, that was maybe her alarm to leave. Why had she gone to work so early before this time? So I suppose there are two events here. What had he eaten before he went running? Never a good idea to eat so close to exercising. Okay, so let's move on to our second tense of the lesson, the past perfect continuous. He had been eating breakfast. Again, not so difficult in structuring and forming, but it's used slightly differently. So we use the past perfect continuous to discuss an ongoing past event that continued right up until another event in the past. So we're kind of saying, whereas with past perfect, there was just two events, here we're saying the earliest event kept happening until something happened. Let's see an example. Of course, subject plus had plus been plus verb ing, our gerund here. Okay, so again, the had, doesn't matter what subject we use. She had been exercising before she rested. So two things, exercising and resting. So the exercising happened right up until she rested. She had been exercising before she rested. Here we've got a slightly different structure. The car was wet because the car was wet because it had been raining. So here our real perfect continuous, past perfect continuous structure is at the end of the sentence. Really interesting to be able to use starting with past perfect continuous, like example 1, but also finishing with the past perfect continuous, like example 2. Okay, and to use in the negative form, simply use had not, contraction hadn't. I hadn't been studying before I took my test. Not a clever idea. Okay, could we actually finish this in a negative form with the past perfect continuous? Let's take a look at an example. My friends were happy because they had been hanging out together. So we have this final part, which is the past perfect continuous, starting with they, which I suppose I could highlight red as my subject. They had been hanging out together. My friends were happy because they had been hanging out together. Which, of course, hanging out, meeting, was the first event, the first continuous event. Okay, let's take a look at the past perfect continuous in the question form. So begin with our 6 W's if you want, and then quite simply had or hadn't, plus our subject pronouns, plus been, and plus the gerund, the ing verb. Why had she been lying to me? Where had you been travelling before here? Okay, so some interesting question forms there. Again, as a little bit of an extension to make it a bit trickier, you could quite easily contract the W word and auxiliary verb. So for example, 1, why had, why'd she been lying to me? That would sound probably more native. Example 2, where had, where'd you been travelling before here? Where'd you been travelling before here? Much more native in sound. Okay, it's time for our animated section of this lesson.